I don't care. Well, say hello. Hi.
Hello, everybody.
Say hello.
Well, I didn't know if
We're
you were
talking
rolling.
amongst ourselves and they're
I
listening.
didn't know that the tape was rolling.
Even shut up.
Oh, I didn't see that. Okay, well,
Can't see, can't hear.
that's right.
Great.
Here we go. Anyhow, Shabbat Shalom to you who've joined us and those of you who are going to join us later by way of, what do we call it? By way of Vimeo. So let's get started with the word of prayer.
So did we decide that I'm praying?
I think we decided
All
we
right,
didn't.
let's pray. Avinu Malkeinu, our Father and our King, we thank you that we can come together and think about and discuss about things that are of interest and sometimes confusing, sometimes just curious things, so that we might better understand you and we might better serve you. Thank you for all the things you do for us and be with us tonight as we discuss. B'Shem Yeshua, Meshachim, in the name of Yeshua, our Messiah. Amen.
Amen. Now, you know, I'm thinking that since Mike was here the last time, and he's not here presently this time, maybe we should hold this one off to see if he comes
Except
back.
we had the plea about doing the thing for that Bible study, so they might be coming not during it, but later
Later
in
in
the
the-
week.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and start this one since it was submitted. Way
It shouldn't
back in-
take us very long.
No, it shouldn't take us very long. Way back in March. Tell you what, let's, since this one came before, we'll do them in the order in which they arrived. Okay. Eye of the Needle. That shouldn't
All
take
right,
us too long.
so, I do have a question concerning the gate named Eye of the Needle that has been uncovered. I'm very, very sad to tell you that the gate called the Eye of the Needle does not exist. It was written about, I believe, starting in the 1930s in a book, something entitled Everyday Life in Bible Lands, and the person who wrote it, I'm sure they're probably no longer with us. I'm sure they were very sincere in what they were writing, but some of the things that he wrote in this book, they're not true. So there is no gate called the Eye of the Needle, and as far as I know, there's never been a gate called the Eye of the Needle, and my understanding is this is a metaphor. It's just a hypothetical example. Like, it's easier for a rich man to get into heaven than it is for a camel to go through an eye of a needle. It's a comparison. It's a metaphorical comparison designed to teach a lesson. It's not archaeological knowledge at all. And I think you're the one who told me that this phrase is directly from the Talmud?
From the rabbinic writings.
From rabbinic writings.
Yeah, there's a similar metaphor.
So it isn't even original in the New Testament. Is it Yeshua that says it?
Yes.
So he's quoting the rabbis. I know that sometimes makes people nervous when we tell them that, because they think that Yeshua is making up brand new sayings just because he could. But more often there are plenty of times when he's quoting the rabbis directly. So I'm very sorry if that hurts your faith, that there is no gate called the Eye of the Needle. In a certain way, I can't help you with that. You're going to have to learn to cope with it.
Okay.
Do you have anything else to say?
No, you said it, and it's said it well. And so,
And over to you.
over to me. All right, then, no, actually, over to the next question.
Next question.
My wife and I often discuss the fact that Adonai is outside of time. In other words, non-temporal, as we are. The question that always comes up is, Are those who precede us in the Messiah aware of the differences between the times of earthly death, or do we all just appear at the same moment together in heaven despite our earthly departure? We would be very interested in knowing if there's a uniquely Jewish perspective on this. Okay, very interesting question. And let me start at the back and then move forward. There is, in fact, a midrash. I believe it's the 15th or 16th century, so it's a late midrash.
You might want to mention what a midrash is.
Okay, thank you. A midrash. Midrash is a term that originally meant it was just related to the endeavor of interpretation, learning the meaning, researching out the meaning of a passage, in this case a biblical passage, from the word darash. And you got me sidetracked on something, but it's an important sidetrack. In the days of the Second Temple period, it was basically that and not much, if anything, more at all. It was various teachers explaining or unwrapping this biblical texts, particularly to enable their listeners or their students to better understand those biblical texts. Sometime after the destruction of the Second Temple, although it could have had its seeds even earlier into the Second Temple period, the understanding of Midrash began to, or the process of Midrash began to, how should I put it, expand, so that Midrash then took in various elements, including if there was what appeared to be a contradiction between two biblical texts, the Midrash interpretation at that time period would be to endeavor to find a way to show how those texts did not, in fact, contradict each other. As this process of Midrash developed even further and later, it began, and this is all coming from the ancient rabbis and teachers, the sages of old, and then moving on through more modern sages. And when I say modern, I don't mean our day and age. I mean those who first were influential after the temple was destroyed, and then, in fact, continued to be. And there were some who then were, how should I put it? They were current contemporaries with the writing down of the Talmud in its two stages around the end of the 2nd century, beginning of the 3rd century, and then the second stage being the 4th and 5th centuries. So those who were around those latter time periods and then even later, that's what we're calling something more modern in this context. So the Midrash began to include explanations that went beyond just the direct interpretation of the biblical texts to include, how should I put it, stories, lessons, elaborations to applications to better understand the subject under discussion. Okay, so that's what could be several courses in Midrash, somewhat condensed into just several minutes. Okay, so Midrashic material eventually included somewhat legendary material as well. Now, this particular Midrash from the 15th or 16th century, and I could not think of how to quickly lay my hands on it because it's very well said and it's a short paragraph. This particular Midrash happens to be on the issue of, and we're not going to get sidetracked on this, what is often called in theological circles, predestination versus free will. And in effect, the Midrash is saying that neither and both are in play. The Midrash went along these lines. It basically said that because God is outside of time, he is not time bound. Therefore, all things are present with him. because everything is because he lives in what we would call the eternal present. Of course, present in the grammatical sense doesn't apply here because there's no past and future, but it is present in the sense of there. So call it there-ness. So because he's outside of time, then therefore when a person does something is ineffectively the same time as when God sees it, because God is outside of time. So therefore people's actions are not predetermined by God, because predetermination implies that God knew something beforehand and therefore determined it, therefore we have to do it because he determined it. But if God is outside of time, then the event that he is looking at in our lives and where he's at occurs, in effect, what we would call simultaneously. And so the Midrash goes on to say, and boy, I'm going to butcher it here because it was said so well. Just like someone may know the thoughts of someone else, at the moment does not determine that someone else's behavior or action, so with God, it is very simple. There is, speaking of time, we've got to remember that time is one of the dimensions that arose at the very beginning of the universe. And so we think in terms of space and time. The latest, how should we put it, cogitations of scientists in this field are that within the first mini fraction of a microsecond of the universe's existence, the universe collapsed from some 10 or a dozen or maybe even more dimensions into the 4 that we now know of, the so-called 3 dimensions of space plus the dimension of time. So we are then bound by these dimensions of time and space, but God is not, because he's the one that started it all in the first place. Now, if God exists out of time, and if when we pass on from this earth, we then get, for lack of a better term, translated or transposed or transferred into the presence of God, which raises in and of itself all kinds of other questions that we're not going to get sidetracked on. If that's the case, then we have joined God in a timeless, dimensionless, if you would have it, universe. I like the way the question was phrased because many years ago had a discussion with one of my colleagues, and this particular person said, suggested based on this understanding that means then in effect we all arrive into God's presence at what we might consider, for lack of a better term, the same time. So yes, your phrasing here is, do we all just appear at the same moment together in heaven despite our earthly departure? Is not a bad way of putting that and describing this particular issue about a God who lives outside of time. So the answer to that is yes.
As far as we know.
As far as we can tell, trying to describe it from within our time, space, continuum and dimensionality. So another part of the question has to do with the awareness of differences between the times of early death. I don't know what kind of sense of awareness others who have so-called preceded us, or we when we get there, will have relating to time, because frankly speaking, to be totally transparent, I have never lived outside the dimension of time, so I don't know how to describe what we might be aware of or not. So that's my best response. And yes, the rabbis did apparently reflect on this, because we have that 15th or 16th century midrash. And if I recall correctly, too, some of the ancient rabbis also did reflect on the idea that not only is God outside of time and outside our dimensionality, but they seem to have been aware of at least something that would be akin to what I mentioned earlier on, like 10 dimensions within the time-space continuum. And then, so there's rabbinic thinking on that as well. Okay, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think, I remember telling you at one point, I don't know how long ago it was, could have been 20 years ago or so. Because after you've been married as long as you do, you know, time has no meaning anymore.
Yeah, you stepped outside of time. Yeah.
You stepped outside of time, and I like to say I was born married because I can't remember anything else. And but if we're thinking about, so I'm in bed and I'm about to die. Everyone around me is very sad. I presume, I don't know, maybe it was a car crash and there's nobody there. But anyway, you can tell I've been in a car crash, so I know exactly how that feels. The 1 minute you're driving along and the next minute you're stopped and it's very quiet. That it sort of made sense to me. Remember that the story of what's called the rapture, where the people who are alive when Yeshua returns to earth are going to be caught up in the clouds and join him, correct? Mm-hmm. But they're joining him in order to come to earth and do battle.
That's the idea. First away and then come back later.
Oh, but what if you're on earth and you
just get caught up?
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
They get caught up.
Yeah.
But that's when to me, I go from death to coming back to earth to fight the battle, the last battles.
In your time zone, yes.
Which sort of, when I was thinking about that, sort of blew my mind. But not everybody comes back to fight those last battles. It's 144,000.
No, the 140.
Okay, see, it's been a long time since we talked about end time things.
Yes. Now, the 144,000 apparently are those who, at least is how we understand the event sequence, are there on earth who are followers of Yeshua, who are in fact involved full-time in getting the message out to those around them.
Okay, but there is heavenly armies are going to come
shortly there
to battle with the forces of the anti-Messiah.
Yes. Yeah.
So I always think that would be a very, very nice thing to leave your loved ones and then wake up and you're involved in coming back for the battle.
Yeah.
So I guess you have a choice. We don't know.
No. We just aren't given all the information, so we speculate the best that we can, and then as Patrice was saying, it's as if when we get caught up at what is often called the rapture, we step outside of time. So what's it like then, in a sense, to step back in time to participate in Yeshua cleaning up the earth and on Yeshua's actual rule on earth? So we don't know. So, but yeah.
It is interesting to think about, though, even though we can't be sure. It is interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Any questions? Because what we just talked about intersects with so many areas that it may have raised some questions. So if they're related to this or as a result of this, then let's deal with those.
I don't even want to go there, man.
Okay. Those of you who are on the monitor, whether we can see you or not, any questions on this, on what we just talked about? Ooh, okay. Then we did it well enough.
They're sleeping in.
I'll just say thanks. I was the one who asked that question. And very grateful for you to fill me in with a little bit that it actually is discussed. And it's an interesting thought for sure.
Yeah.
Suppose if we do go off and come back, why? we'll lose that flexibility for while we're here in our earthly realm again, but that's okay. As long as I'm with Yeshua, I'm good.
There we are.
Cool.
There we
Yeah, we knew it had come from you, Mike, but we try not to identify the person just to protect their anonymity. But since you self-identified, that's fine.
That's fine, that's fine. No,
Cool.
I appreciate you answering the question for me.
It is the realm, in the same kind of realm as predestination and free will.
Oh, it
It's
definitely
that
packs
kind
that.
of philosophical realm where you can make certain statements, but they're not complete and sometimes they're not extremely satisfying either.
Yeah, in fact, a rabbi of old, 2nd century Rabbi Akiva, put it this way, and again, I wish I had his quote directly in front of me, says, I'm going to paraphrase it because I can't quote it exactly. He said, everything is foreknown and yet free will is given. So, in our dimensionality, it's tough to figure out how that worked, but that's the way he phrased it. And he was not the author of the Midrash that I mentioned earlier. Okay, then, next one.
Okay, that's done.
We just wrapped up 2 questions really quickly. This question has to do with the perceived antagonistic relationship between the Pharisees and Yeshua in the Newer Testament. And how can our understanding of the culture of the ancient Near East affect how we interpret Scripture, especially when dealing with concepts such as complete and wholehearted versus perfect, as well as how the Torah is viewed in Second Temple Judaism versus Hellenism. Okay, that's actually a whole other question as I'm looking at it.
There's 2 in 1.
Yeah. The answer to the first part of the question doesn't necessarily rely on the second part, but I will say this about the second part. The second part is a very important question that relates to a concept we know of as worldview. Our worldview in the Western world is quite distinct from the worldview of the people in the Near East. And by Near East, I don't mean Far East, because the perspective of the Far East is not the same as the perspective of the Near East. To elaborate on that, that kind of understanding is quite well reflected on the quote that I gave you, the semi-quote of Rabbi Akiva. Coming from that kind of understanding, he was able to make the kind of statement he made that I shared with you, that these are things we don't have all the answers for, so we are willing and able to hold them in tension. We're able to tolerate paradoxes. By we, I mean if you're living in a Near Eastern perspective. By the way, we are all living in the Western perspective. What is called Hellenism, thank you, Alexander the Great, basically has is almost a uniform, that's not right, but it is throughout the entire Western world. It's not quite the same as what you find in the Far East, because there's a different kind of perspective and worldview there. But in the Western world, this is the dominant perspective without question.
In other words, the right-brain people have taken over, and they do not
That was in
leave.
the left brain?
I'm sorry, the left-brain people have
Yep.
taken over, and they don't leave very much room for other people. I like to say the engineer's world. So here's not tolerating paradox. If we said that the biblical perspective tolerates paradox, that would not be a happy thing if you're an engineer. Because if you're an engineer, you tend to be, things are either right or wrong, they're either black or white, they're either positive or negative. There is a split in them, and they do not seem to be able to understand or really put into practice the idea that 2 things can be true at the same time. I apologize to any engineers that are out there that are able to tolerate paradox, but I haven't known too many of them, or I haven't known engineers who could tolerate certain kinds of paradox. But unfortunately, the way the Bible has been studied, especially in the West, I would say since maybe the early 1900s, it's been this very categorical viewpoint of this is either true or it's false, it's yes or it's no, it's in or it's out, it's black or it's white. And using that rubric, so many statements in the Bible sound like nonsense. They sound like double talk. Unless we realize that Yeshua and his world were able to tolerate things that didn't seem to jive, to use sort of a slang term. Have
Yeah.
I been clear?
If you want more on the contrasting worldviews and how they impact the way in which we look at things, in at least 3 different courses that I teach, I spend a section of the course on this particular subject. So you're welcome to join us for any of those. And the shortest version of that discussion runs about probably 2 full class sessions, if I recall.
So that'd be like 4 hours, 4 or 5 hours.
2.5 hours. I mean, by class sessions, I mean, because in my class, we break it down 2 sessions each week. So yeah, at least, and in the larger version, oh yeah.
Larger version of what?
Of my treatment of this matter, there is a 4 or 5 hour block that we devote to it. So to try to condense it and to summarize all the parts and pieces is a little difficult.
And also that means that the logic that's being used is slightly foreign to Western logic. In other words, logic in the Bible is not a mathematical construct like it tends to be in Western society. And so things that sound, we were just talking about Star Trek. That's not logical. Say, 21st century Americans. That's not logical. That cannot possibly be true because it's not logical. The world is full of illogical things that are still true. And that would be tolerating paradox also.
One small slice of this, because it sort of relates to the question from before about time. The ancient Near Eastern world tended to be event-oriented as opposed to time-oriented. So the question of time very rarely, if ever, came up because the focus was not on the time of the event, but on the event itself. And so when we ask time-related questions, then we tend to be asking the wrong kind of question about the biblical text. And you can see this, for example, in the way in which often the Gospels are approached, because they're approached from the Western perspective, assumed to be chronologically oriented or ordered, and the Gospels are not necessarily chronologically ordered or oriented. They are event-oriented, so you cannot necessarily derive a straightforward chronological sequence from them.
It doesn't mean that they're faulty, and it doesn't mean that they're less than true. It means they are not structured in chronological method the way we would structure a biography of a person's life. I always think of when we talk about this, about the Gospels and how they have incidents, but not necessarily in the order in which they happened in Yeshua's life or in the life of the people there. I think of this. So when we made friends with a very lovely man who was one of those people, he had studied too much theology, that kind of a person. And he said very seriously to me, I don't know if you heard this discussion, he said, well, when did Yeshua throw the moneylenders out of the temple? Because for the Synoptic Gospels, he throws them out about 3/4 of the way into the story. And for the Gospel of John, he throws them out very early. Chapter 2. And so he says, therefore, Yeshua did it twice. and I was going, I think I hear my mother calling me. I gotta go now. But I just wanted to say, yeah, that's not a good answer. That it's so distinctive, and what he says is so distinctive. It's probably not a good answer, but John was not interested in giving things. First he was born, and then he grew up, and then he did these things. And Yeshua did not have to have two different incidents where he threw the money changers out of the temple. In fact, he probably didn't. But John is putting it there to make certain rhetorical points.
All right, so that part of the question. The antagonistic relationship between the Pharisees and Yeshua. This is something that has been assumed almost universally for centuries and centuries and centuries. And it impacts, I was going to say infects. It really does infect the way in which you read and interpret the Gospels.
Like a plague.
Yeah, exactly. It's assumed that the Pharisees are the enemies of Yeshua, and Yeshua is the enemies of the Pharisees, is the enemy of the Pharisees. Unfortunately, before responding to the issue itself, I want to take it one step further, and this is extremely important at this particular time of year, and I'll explain that in just a second. It is then often assumed that the rabbis of early Judaism were in effect, the descendants, so to speak, of the Pharisees. And that assumption, by the way, is largely correct. But here's what happens. If Yeshua was against the Pharisees of his day, then he's against the rabbis of the days that followed him, or the rabbis who were emerging already in Yeshua's time. Therefore, we, as followers of Yeshua, must be opposed to or must disregard everything that the rabbis of early Judaism or classical Judaism taught. There are two significant, very serious problems here. That means those who are followers of Yeshua, and by the way, this attitude is quite common even in Messianic Judaism. This anti-Pharisaic and therefore anti-rabbinic attitude is prevalent throughout Messianic Judaism. Therefore, two problems. As Messianic Jews, we should ignore what the rabbis have taught and in fact oppose largely what they taught. Outside of Messianic Judaism, because the early sages and rabbis helped formulate, and I don't want to use the term formulate, help set,
Compile.
even compile, and I'm not sure I've got a right term yet, but they were heavily involved in influencing the direction of Judaism after the Second Temple, or how should I put it, in response to the Second Temple. And if they're the ones who are then viewed as the originators of Judaism as we know it, and Yeshua was against them, then Yeshua would be naturally against Jews and Judaism. And we have heard that far too often in our own lives and in hearing other people teach. All right. It's a misunderstanding of how the rabbis of old, the sages, functioned and how they developed their thinking, and when that thinking, that development started to take place. Frankly, that development started to take place. Here, I'm going to, again, paraphrase since I don't have the direct quote. William F. Albright, who was probably the most prominent archaeologist of the Near East in the previous century, he, as an archaeologist and as a non-Jewish scholar, argued for the fact that the traditions on which Judaism is based can be traced back at least into the exilic period, and then, as he put it, or into times of high antiquity, so even before the exilic period. The exilic period, in case you don't remember, is the time when our people were in exile in Babylon and Assyria. when were we in exile in Babylon and Syria? Well, the exile in Assyria, if you want to stick a rounded off date, is 700 before the Common Era. The exile in Babylon is 600 before the Common Era. So 600 or 700 years before Yeshua, these traditions were already beginning to take shape, and he says perhaps even beyond that. So that's important to understand. This is not something that was a sudden innovation of the rabbis because of the destruction of the temple. Those traditions were already in place and being developed, and then those were the foundations on which the continued response to the destruction of the temple then took place after the temple was destroyed the second time. Okay, that's a quick summation of history. I mentioned, yes, if it is perceived that Yeshua is against the Pharisees, therefore that he's against the rabbis, and therefore that we should be against the rabbis, or that Christians should be against the Jews because the Jews were Yeshua's enemies, then guess what comes about very readily? It's called anti-Semitism.
What's persecution?
By anti-Semitism, I'm including not only the hostility and the hatred towards Jewish people in Judaism, but also the persecution of the Jewish people. Now, let me bring it back to where I mentioned that this is a timely thing to discuss. We commemorated Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, last night as part of our service. Tuesday is Yom HaShoah, it's Holocaust Remembrance Day. Concerning the Holocaust, I'm going to just give you, it's a whole subject in and of itself, and we've got a friend and professor who does teach a course on the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. Our good friend Linda Leckie. Dr. Leckie teaches that course. Anyhow, if you want more on that, that's the way you want to go, but I'm going to give you two things. Number one, we had a friend, a Holocaust survivor, who a number of years ago now has passed away. And she was also a survivor of the concentration camps, and I forget whether it's Dachau or Bergen-Belsen, but she in fact shared this with us, and by us I don't mean just us, but those who were actually in the building when she spoke to us at one of our synagogue services. She did so on a couple occasions. She said when she walked into the concentration camp, there was a sign there for all to see. You are here because you killed our God. So that's how direct this thing of anti-Semitism can become. That's how directly anti-Semitism can be connected to this anti-Jewish or anti-Judaism attitude that's derived from this anti-Pharisaic attitude. Hitler, when he, in the 30s, mid or late 30s, not his 30s, but the years 1930s, after he viewed a passion play, one of the classic...
At Oberammergau.
Yes, which is the home of the classic...
It's the oldest and the most famous in Germany.
And on passion plays, if you want to have more information, you need to read our book called The Distortion, Misrepresentation of Yeshua and the Jewish People Down Through the Ages. But anyhow, after seeing that, he is recorded as having said, everyone, and again I'm paraphrasing because I don't have the quote here, everyone needs to see this play because then they will understand why I am doing what I'm doing. So this anti-Pharisaic attitude, anti-Jewish attitude, has serious repercussions. Now, having set the stage for us, let me deal with the question in respond to the question in a little more detail. I want to go to two passages of Scripture, both from the sermon, first from the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 5, verses 17 to 20, Yeshua says, I've not come to abolish the law and the prophets, Torah and the prophets. I've come to fulfill them, and the term literally means what it sounds like, to fill them full, not to set them aside. If he came not to set them aside, then he is not being anti-Judaism here. He is being very pro-Judaism. And then he says, in verse 20, unless your righteousness, unless your behavior exceeds that of even the Pharisees. You will jeopardize your status in the kingdom of God. The Pharisees were among the most devout of the people in the Second Temple period. Yeshua is saying you need to be at least that devout. Now, if the Pharisees were the kind of people that are often described as by both many Messianic Jews and much of Christianity, then their level of observance is not way up here, something to be attained, but way down here, something that's to be stepped on. Use this hand so you can see the way down there. Okay, without slugging my wife. Because if the way in which they lived is way down here, then to exceed what they're doing is no big deal. But if their status is way up here, as it was, they were that highly respected by the people of the Second Temple period, then what Yeshua is saying is you need to aim for the very top and even beyond that. So, an incorrect understanding of the Pharisees completely undercuts what Yeshua is saying there at the heart of the Sermon on the Mount. He made it even clearer. Matthew chapter 23, verses 2 and 3. He says, whatever the Pharisees teach, do it. That flies directly in the face of the anti-Judaism elements within the church and the anti-Pharisaic and rabbinic elements within Messianic Judaism. He says, whatever the Pharisees teach, do it. And remember, it's the rabbis, those who are called the rabbis now historically, although there were rabbis in the time of the Pharisees. He was saying, you need to do what the rabbis and the Pharisees teach. He says, now, one of our earliest office managers here at the synagogue, Barb, did her master's thesis at the seminary when she got her degree on the Sermon on the Mount and the parallels between the Sermon on the Mount and rabbinic teachings. Very extensive piece of work that she did to show that what Yeshua was teaching in the Sermon on the Mount is exactly what the rabbis of his day and even later were teaching. One of our former members here at the synagogue, Slade Hansen, has put together a multi-volume reference set, and I think it's got 7 or 8 volumes to it, in which he catalogs, he gives you the reference in the rabbinic writings, more specifically the Talmud, but in the rabbinic writings, that are parallel to the references that you find in Scripture. This is volume after volume after volume, and I mean that quite literally. Our good friend and colleague, some of you have heard him speak here at the synagogue. He's a former dean at the seminary in Yeshiva. Dr. Thomas Trebelhorn wrote a book called Opening Rabbinic Doors to the Gospels. And what he has done there in that particular book is to look at what's in the Gospels and to show the parallels that there are there in the Gospels, parallels to the Gospels found in the rabbinic writings. In other words, the writings of the Pharisees and the rabbis of old, they are paralleled in the teachings of Yeshua in the Gospels. From a Jewish non-Messianic perspective, I think his first name is Samuel, but his last name is Lachs, L-A-C-H-S. It's simply called a rabbinic commentary to the New Testament. In all fairness, it's not the whole of the Newer Testament, he's just talking about the Gospels, but he does the same thing. He goes through the various passages in the Gospels and provides you with the teaching and the reference that you can find in the rabbinic material that parallel to the teaching of the Gospels. We spent a good chunk of one of our courses here, Gospels in their Jewish context course, that deals with a lot of this as well. So there is much material here to then validate what I say in a number of courses, and I'll say it again here. There is nothing that you can find in the teachings of Yeshua that you cannot find in the teachings of the rabbis. And just so to make sure that I'm not misunderstood, let me repeat it. There is nothing that you can find in the teachings of Yeshua that is not paralleled in the teachings of the rabbis, with one exception: the statements and claims he made about himself. So what makes him unique is not his teachings, although they're powerful teachings. What makes him unique is the authority he claimed behind those teachings, the authority of God himself. That's what makes him unique, what he said about himself. Now, I want to do two more things before wrapping this up. By the way, I thought I noted that. Speaking of what are some of the teachings of the Pharisees, 1476. There's a very interesting chart, and very helpful to a large degree, not without its flaws, that you can find in the NIV Study Bible. And what it does is it has a chart on the major Jewish sects of that time period: Pharisees, Essenes, Sadducees, and Zealots. Okay? They get the first one wrong, which is unfortunate. It says, along with the Torah, they accept it as equally inspired and authoritative, all material contained within the oral tradition. That's incorrect. They considered the stuff that's in the oral tradition very instructive and important, but they did not accept as equally inspired and authoritative. That's a misunderstanding that is current both in Christianity and in Messianic Judaism. And you can tell that they didn't, since that's the first one, because anytime you have a reading of a biblical text, whether it's from the Torah or the prophets, what happens? You have to say a blessing. If you read from the Talmud or the rabbinic writings, there's never a blessing associated with that being read in, and parts are read in synagogue services. On free will and determination, they held to a mediating view that made it impossible for either free will or the sovereignty of God to cancel out each other. Gosh, we talked about that a number of minutes ago, didn't we? It's Rabbi Akiva. They accepted a rather developed hierarchy of angels and demons. You can see that reference too in the writings of the Rabbi Paul.
But it comes from Judaism.
It comes from Judaism. They taught that there was a future for the dead. Oh, big surprise. This one they get a little wrong, and I'll explain why. They believed in the immortality of the soul and in reward and retribution after death. Before you hop in and say, oh, yes, yes, yes. No. The Hellenistic perspective is of immortality of the soul. The Near Eastern perspective is the resurrection of the dead, and those are two different things, and we don't have the time to separate those out for us. But what they're trying to say here is correct. They believed in the resurrection of the dead and in reward and retribution after death. They were champions of human equality.
Sounds good to me.
The emphasis of their teaching was ethical rather than theological. In other words, it's not what you put up here, but what you walk out on the ground that's important. And if that sounds familiar, it ought to. The good chunk of the book of James, written by Yeshua's brother, is exactly on that. In other words, the teachings of the Pharisees are very much the teachings of Yeshua. There's a book that I use in that Gospels course called Jesus the Pharisee that talks about this in great detail, as it compares various schools within the Pharisees and shows that Yeshua is consistent with one of those schools. It's called the School of Hillel. I'm going to give you two striking examples. Before I give you two striking examples, I want to deal with, well, what about Yeshua calling the Pharisees hypocrites? And you find it loaded throughout Matthew 23. What about Yeshua calling the Pharisees hypocrites? Well, here's what you need to understand. If you look at this up in the Talmud, and you will find, and in case you want to look it up in the Talmud, it's Sotah, either 19, 20, or 21, or perhaps chunks of all of those. You will find that the authors of the Talmud, who were the Pharisees and their descendants, also spoke about hypocrisy. And they described 7 kinds of Pharisees, of which they commend only 2 of the 7. So they speak about the hypocrisy of 5 different kinds of Pharisees. So they recognized the hypocrisy that was inherent among some of them, and they called it out. And in the way in which they spoke about the hypocrites, it almost sounds like they're quoting Yeshua. Yeshua may have been quoting them, depending on which happened to come first in this particular case. So, even in that critique of hypocrisy, Yeshua is very Pharisaic and very Talmudic in that sense. Speaking about the Talmud, there's a passage in the Talmud that reflects directly on yet another misunderstood, mistaught passage. This is Matthew chapter 12. Matthew 12 is the story of when the Yeshua and his followers were walking through the on their way, and they ended up walking through a field on Shabbat. And so as they're walking through that field, they're picking up grain, and they're taking the grain and they're breaking it apart and they're eating it. Now, if that, I like to say, if that had been corn and they were shucking the corn, then they would have been the initiators of popcorn, as they were popping the corn in their mouth. No, that's not. Anyhow, so there's an interaction between Yeshua and some of those religious leaders, and on this idea of working on Shabbat. And Yeshua disagrees with the leaders, or actually the leaders disagree with Yeshua and his followers. There's a lot that can be said about this particular text. First of all, they weren't actually harvesting grain, because in those days nobody would go into an uncut field and then begin to harvest it for themselves. It's based on a text in the Torah, a couple texts in the Torah, that says when you harvest your grain, if anything falls to the ground, leave it on the ground. If you harvest your field, leave the corners of your field uncut. Why? So that the poor and the needy can come and pick these things up. Now look, this being Shabbat, there is no local deli available for the disciples to satisfy their hunger.
There's no Wawa.
There's no Wawa. So they do what they're supposed to. They do what is part of the culture of that day. They pick up the grain that's fallen, they take it, they shuck what's in there in their hands, and they pop it into their mouths and they eat it. And this is what causes concern for the religious leadership that is critiquing Yeshua here. Let me quote to you from the Talmud. It's Shabbat 128a. It says, handfuls of grain which can be taken by the handful, can be shucked and on Shabbat, and the one who's shucking it can eat of it. So the statement in the Shabbat 128a in the Talmud describes exactly what the disciples were doing, and that's exactly what's in line with rabbinic and Talmudic teaching. Fair enough, it's a passage that's grossly misinterpreted and mistaught. Mark chapter 7 is a text, and I forget where it is, somewhere either 14 or 19, where it comes to a conclusion, where it says, so Yeshua declared all foods clean. That's how many of the modern translations have it. The King James, by the way, does not have it that way, but simply talks about it in the same way that the parallel passage in Matthew 15, I believe it is, talks about it. Yeshua is there describing what we call the process of digestion and elimination. He's not declaring anything, but he's simply saying these things are cleansed or purged from your system.
It all comes out in the end.
Exactly, it all comes out in the end. Now, the very form of his response in Mark chapter 7 is a direct parallel to the form of the way in which the rabbis of those days taught. So not only is what he's teaching in line with the rabbis there, but the very form he uses is. But there's a classic example of this in the teachings of Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was absolutely instrumental in the survival of Judaism after the Second Temple. And he is one of the classic examples of this four-part teaching. Again, I don't want to take the time to elaborate on the four-part teaching, but that four-part teaching that he exemplifies so well is exactly the framework of Yeshua's teaching in Mark chapter 7. So not only in the content, but in the framework of his teaching, he was very rabbinic, very Pharisaic. But what about the time in John chapter 8 that he said to some of the religious leaders, "You're of your father the devil"? Isn't that fairly strong? Well, it is fairly strong, but again, it's part of the vocabulary and the discussion and deliberation found in rabbinic circles. There's a classic statement, and I can look it up, but can't remember exactly where it is, coming directly again from the Talmud, where one brother calls another brother, I believe the term he uses is, you are the spawn of Satan. That's effectively the same thing as saying the devil's your father. And he's saying this about his very own brother because his very own brother ruled in favor of one school of the Pharisees as opposed to the other school of the Pharisees. And if I'm remembering correctly, the person who's involved here is Ben Shatach, and Shatach was one of the most famous of the rabbis of the late Second Temple period. So this kind of interaction took place as part of the discussion and debate that took place within Pharisaic circles themselves, even in what he's saying here. And there are even stronger statements that you can find as the Pharisees discuss with each other. Even in this particular statement, Yeshua is being very Pharisaic, not anti-Pharisaic. He's simply siding with one side of the discussion as opposed to the other, and does so frequently. So, having said all that, I will say, to summarize it and to make the points. Number one, if you are anti-Pharisaic, then you are misunderstanding Yeshua and the Pharisees and what Yeshua taught. And you are laying the foundation for anti-Semitism, which in fact bred and produced the Holocaust. If you are anti-Judaism, you are doing exactly the same thing. You're laying the groundwork, the framework for anti-Semitism. The book that we wrote called The Distortion deals with some of this same kind of material. So this is absolutely significant stuff, and it's very timely for right now. So I will conclude by saying what I said on a couple occasions already before. There's nothing that you can find in the teachings of Yeshua that you cannot find parallels to in the teachings of the rabbis. And remember, the rabbis were Jews, so we dare not be anti-Jewish, anti-Judaism, or however one way you want to phrase it. The only things that differentiated Yeshua was what he had to say about himself and the authority he claimed for himself, which was the authority of God himself. Fair enough? That was a long response, but there's much, much, much more to it than that. I will add one more thing since it is seasonal, and that is a Palm Sunday reflection. Because it deals with the other very important element, or another very important element that's inherent within this kind of question. Didn't the Jewish people reject and or kill Yeshua? And the answer to both questions is no. Acts 4:27 lays the blame. We have to deal with this verse just recently. Acts 4:27 lays the blame this way. Herod, Pontius Pilate, the Gentiles, and then the people of Israel, and the people of Israel are reflected there as you can find it in its larger context in Acts. It was the actual leadership involved with the temple, the high priest and his associates. By the way, most of the high priest's allies were Sadducees, not Pharisees. Okay, so who's responsible for the death of Yeshua? And this is what Peter and the apostles said in Acts 4:27. Herod, not a Jew. Pontius Pilate, not a Jew. The Gentiles, not Jews. And then finally, the people of Israel, or more specifically, the temple leadership. Another verse popped in my mind, popped right back out of my mind.
They were very bad Jews.
Yeah.
Temple leadership were terrible, terrible Jews.
The rabbi said this in 1 Corinthians 2 concerning the rulers of this world. Who were the rulers of this world in his time? Rome and the Roman leaders. He says, I forget whether he says the rulers of this world crucified Yeshua, or Yeshua was crucified by the rulers of this world. So I forget whether it's passive or active in form, but he lays it out just that way. Back to Palm Sunday. It's just time. It's just prior to Passover time. People are arriving, flooding to Jerusalem to prepare for Passover to celebrate it there. Yeshua comes riding in on that donkey, and he's greeted by the crowds in Jerusalem. Now, who were the crowds in Jerusalem at Passover time? Jews. And in 4 different ways, the gospel accounts tell us that they recognized him as the Messiah. In fact, they call him Son of David, the most common messianic title of that time period. The crowds in Jerusalem at Passover time acknowledged Yeshua as the Messiah. Period. More to that story, but that's not time for now, but I wanted to add that in since that's also seasonal, since we just finished the resurrection and prior to that Palm Sunday.
Yeah. Let me just say that I wish I had a nickel for sermons that are given on Palm Sunday that say the following, or words to the following. The same crowds that welcomed him as the Messiah turned their back on him and totally rejected him by Friday. That is a lie. It's not true. Even though people get a blessing out of that, or I don't know what but it's not what happened at all. And that's very clear by different stories within the last day of Yeshua's life. Different stories that you can read yourself, especially in the book of Luke.
Yeah. 2 things. First of all, those events did not take place on Friday.
Well,
I know. They took place on Wednesday. And the text, one of the texts that Patrice is referring to is Luke 23, verse 37. It says, the crowds lined the streets and they wept when they saw Yeshua being carried off, being taken away, drawn away, dragged away to his execution. That's where the crowds were on that day.
he had no power to change anything.
Nope. So again, more on that story, the distortion. Okay. Takes a deep breath. Any questions?
Yeah. What was the name, and is it available anywhere that you know to purchase the multi-volume set you were talking about that references all of the biblical and rabbinic references?
Yes, Slade Henson, Henson. I'm thinking that it's available on Amazon. I forget, it's like 7 or 8.
Do you want me to go get a copy?
I know exactly where it is.
Oh, okay.
It's yeah, he was one of our students,
He
by
was
the
one
way.
of our students. Save your money. Like, maybe your kids can't go to college right away because you've bought these books.
Okay, now that I'm looking at
So you
it,
can show them what it looks like in the.
yeah. Now that I'm looking at it, you can see it's the Rabbinic Reference Bible, and it has to do with it. It's really I misdescribed it. I think it just has to do with he's giving you the passages in the Talmud that relate to the specific texts found within the Older Testament, because it's called the connection between Tanakh and tradition. So you can see how all the stuff that is in the rabbinic discussions is directly based on the biblical texts. So, but for the other one, which is far less expensive and far shorter, Rabbinic Commentary to the New Testament by Lachs, Lachs. That just deals with the parallels between the Gospels and the rabbinic literature.
This does not have Slade's name in it anywhere.
Really?
No, I don't see it anywhere.
That's not cool.
So, well, he would be very humble.
Yeah.
I don't even know how he got this published.
He may have had it published himself, but anyhow,
This
there it
is,
is.
but this is just the one for Leviticus. This
Yeah.
is the volume for Leviticus.
Right.
So if you want to, how many of these volumes there are, I have no idea. But they're hardback, they're big, so that you're not going blind when you read the small print here. It's really quite a bit of work.
Okay, and just to give you, hold that up again.
Yes.
This way. Okay, this is the one that involves the connections, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel,
And the minor prophets.
and the minor prophets.
So that's a thicker one.
In other words, this is the one that deals with
Prophecy.
the prophets, yeah. Yeah, what would be called in Jewish tradition the prophets. Okay, fair enough. So, hopefully that helps. Other questions, if any? All right. Then, would you define the terms pesha, transgression, avon, iniquity, chata'a, sin? I thought it was chatat, but anyhow, it's tough to read these in English rather than Hebrew. And how these sins were atoned for in the sacrificial system. FYI, this came up because we had two different people give us two different explanations. My Bible study begged me to ask you the question because we are answering a very important request here.
For free.
For free, because we are now thoroughly confused. I have looked at Avon, and it seems that it must be borne in the sense of you must bear it, and that the only sacrifice covering it was Yom Kippur. One of the teachers said there were sacrifices for Avon other than Yom Kippur. One person said that Pesha was intentional sin and there were sacrifices for it. The other said that there are no sacrifices for intentional sin. I see Pesha in Yom Kippur as well, so there is a sacrifice, but I don't see it elsewhere in Leviticus. Baruch Hashem, our Messiah has covered it all according to Isaiah 53. I confine my research to Leviticus and am no expert. Thank you for your response. Okay. That is multi-leveled on a number of fronts, but we'll tackle it as best as we can.
I don't know anything about it. I'm about these, I mean,
You don't know. Just interact with the sacrifices and atonement, if you will,
I can't do that right off the top of my head.
from Leviticus.
There should be a chart in the study Bible where it delineates which sacrifice deals with which.
I would think don't necessarily deal with the individual sacrifices, but just deal with the whole concept of sacrifice and atonement.
Okay, so this has broken down these particular names for sins, which is not what I do. I have to, I'm winking at you and I'm telling you, it looks like an engineer was asking these questions because he's divided them, or she has divided them into the, categories. All right, sin, there it is. The problem of sin is dealt with by the sacrifice system in general. So, the theory behind it is it's the exchange of life principle of atonement. Atonement is based on exchange of life. In other words, in general, if you have done serious sin and you want to be atoned for your sin, in other words, not have it be held against you, then you need to follow the prescriptions that are basically in the book of Leviticus, which in general, you would take a living animal, you would provide your own living animal, and there are several kinds of animals that you can provide, in front of a working priest who's on duty there, and you're going to put your hands on the head of the animal, and you're going to say, may God do this to me, but he will do it, this animal will give up its life for me. The animal is then killed by slitting its throat, usually, and you accept the animal's life in replacement for your life. In other words, the animal has gone to death instead of you. That is the big picture of any kind of sacrifice. There are listed, and this is a pretty comprehensive list here in the NIV Study Bible. I don't know, you don't want me to read this into
No.
the record, do you?
I just showed, since you mentioned that, I thought if you want to look.
And
at it.
here's what they don't have. They don't have the Hebrew words
Yeah.
for each one of these. So that, well, it's a Christian Bible, so why would they have the Hebrew words here? But that would be very helpful if they did. Because right off the top of my head, I don't know the difference between all the ones that you're mentioning, the three that you're mentioning. I'll just mention the English name. There's a burnt offering, which is voluntary. That's voluntary. In other words, you don't have to do it. Atonement for unintentional sin in general. Expression of devotion, commitment, and surrender to God. That's what a burnt offering signifies. A grain offering. Once again, this is a voluntary act of worship. It doesn't have to be done. It's because you want to do it. You recognize that God has been good to you, and it shows your devotion to God. The third one is also voluntary. In other words, you don't have to do this. It's called a fellowship offering, which includes a communal meal. So the animal is sacrificed and then everyone eats from the animal. Voluntary act of worship, thanksgiving, and fellowship. Sin offering. Now we're getting to this is the problem. The sin offering. Mandatory atonement for specific unintentional sin, confession of sin, forgiveness of sin, and cleansing from defilement. I just want to pause right here. Let's think about David. And there was that whole kerfuffle about Bathsheba, or Bathsheba. And remember that whole kerfuffle? And he wants her very badly, but she's married to the Hittite, and so he sends soldiers out. First of all, he sends somebody out to kill him directly, and that doesn't work.
No, first he had him brought home in hopes that he...
Brought home in hopes, because she's pregnant is a problem, and David wants to cover up the pregnancy. And so brings the husband home and hopes that he will sleep with Bathsheba, and that sort of covers that problem. But that didn't work, and so David knowingly commands his general, who's in a battle, to put Uriah the Hittite, her husband, in the front lines of the battle, knowing for sure he's going to be killed. That accrues to David as he murdered the husband. Was that an intentional sin? If that wasn't an intentional sin, I don't know what an intentional sin is. So, did David, however, was he forgiven for that intentional sin? Yes, he was. Did he know he was forgiven for that intentional sin? Yes, he does. Remember, Nathan comes to him and gives him that little story about this little lamb, some mean person kills a little lamb, and David is mad and says, bring me that person, he's terrible, and he needs to be dealt with and punished. And Nathan says to David, that man is you. So, it was an intentional sin. So, it's very nice to have a chat about God doesn't cover intentional sins, except he does, doesn't he? Murder is intentional, and God can forgive for murder because he forgave for David. I don't think David is the only person in the whole entire history of the world that's ever been forgiven for murder. But do you see why people jump on these topics and then they insist that they know these things, and yet it doesn't work out in actual people's lives that are written about. There are many people who have intentional sin, and they're forgiven. So, but it has to go through the sin offering and the guilt offering. That's how you're going to be atoned for many kinds of intentional sin.
Did you finish that, or?
Well, the sin offering and the guilt offering are mandatory. They are not voluntary. The sin offering, a mandatory atonement for specific unintentional sin, except also some intentional sins. Confession of sin, forgiveness of sin, cleansing from defilement, and then the guilt offering. Mandatory atonement for unintentional sin requiring restitution. So it isn't just that you committed sin, you also need to repay. You owe a debt to the person that's been wronged. Cleansing from defilement, make restitution, pay a 20% fine. Those last two are not voluntary, they are mandatory. It's those sins that will, if they're unatoned for, they will threaten your relationship with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Is that clear enough? But as I said, there's no indication of what the individual Hebrew words are for each one of these sacrifices.
More on that kind of stuff in Patrice's course on the Torah, and I will do at least part of a session on this in the fall in the course that's going to be offered in the fall called the Tanakh, or Jewish Roots and Foundations of Scripture, Part 1. Now, while you were talking about David, I decided to look up Psalm 51. The heading for Psalm 51 is a Psalm of David when the prophet Nathan came to him after David had committed adultery with Bathsheba.
And that was intentional too, wasn't it?
I'm going to read the first couple verses and the last couple verses, just so you get an idea from David's
So
perspective.
this is Psalm 51.
You get a feeling for David's perspective reflecting on what Patrice just mentioned. He begins by saying, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin." Now let me quickly hop in. I believe all three of the terms that are mentioned in this question are there in the first verse.
Helpful. Oh, you mean first two verses?
Oh, yes, sorry, the first two verses. And then he continues with transgression and sin and so forth. Look, one of the things, I was going to share some somewhat radical reflections with you, but one of the first of the radical reflections is, you'll notice that in this particular passage, it appears that these things are synonyms one for another. They are not necessarily distinct kinds of sin. And again, in a Western society, we want to have distinct kinds of stuff.
We want a chart, we want the
chart
words put in the chart and the right boxes. Otherwise, it's just a whole bunch of stuff.
But in the Near East, from a Near Eastern perspective, you can use these terms interchangeably, and it sure looks like it here. Okay, so God's unfailing love, His great compassion, He blots out, He cleanses. In other words, was David's prayer here answered? Was this request answered? I don't know of anyone who wants to argue that it wasn't. Because if his wasn't, then perhaps we don't have much
I'm a little worried about myself.
About myself, yes. So here's how he concludes. He says, the sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. O God, you will not despise. That's verses 1 and 2, isn't it? He says here, you don't despise those things. In other words, you respond to them. And then the closing verse says, there will be righteous sacrifices whose whole burnt offerings to delight you, when bulls will be offered on your altar. In other words, he then is saying, now that this has been, as part of this whole package, I can offer sacrifices. And it seems to imply then that he has offered a sacrifice for what we would call an unintentional sin. Okay, so radical statement number 1. The terms could very well be interchangeable, and we may be making far too much out of it if we're just focusing on the terms. By the way, this discussion is very appropriate and timely because what are we reading through right now? The book of Leviticus. And we had read through the first 8 chapters up until last night and this weekend, and the sacrifices have already been described in those first 8 chapters. So very appropriate question, very timely question. All right. 2 more things that came to my mind as you were talking,
Yeah.
and they're important
We
parts of
want
this
to talk
book.
more about intentional sin.
Yeah, but before we talk about intentional sin, I want to get even more radical. Yom Kippur. What did Yom Kippur atone for? Within Jewish thinking, there is a strain, a very strong strain of Jewish thinking, and again, we'll deal with this a bit in the course in the fall semester, that the sacrifices on Yom Kippur were not necessarily there to atone for people's sin, but they were in fact to atone for the place where the offerings were made. In other words, to make those places acceptable places for further offerings and sacrifices in the coming year. And now follow me, because I'm going to do a little loop here, but keep that in mind. One Yom Kippur, during the temple days, the practice was you put a rope around the waist of the high priest. So when he went in to offer the sacrifice into the most holy place, not the place where they were usually offered, but the most holy place, if for any reason God did not accept those sacrifices and he struck down the high priest, no one would have to go in and get struck down themselves in order to claim the body of the high priest. They simply hauled the body of the high priest out by the rope. Now, I don't know of any, that doesn't mean there isn't any record of that event having taken place where the high priest actually got struck down dead. It's possible that that happened. But please remember that there were 2 sacrifices, minimally. One on behalf of the high priest and one on behalf of the people. And then as part of that, then in effect the sins were transferred to what was called the scapegoat. The goat was taken off into the desert, never to be seen again, as a reminder that God had wiped away and washed away the sins. But they were very much related to the practice of what was going on in the temple, to make sure that God continued to consider that a place where sacrifices could be offered. Second radical thing. And by the way, that became how should we put it, a confidence builder on the people's part when the high priest came out both times and he didn't have to be dragged out as a dead body, that God had accepted these sacrifices and therefore their status before God was still intact. Now, my thinking at this point on the other sacrifices, not the Yom Kippur sacrifice, but the ones mentioned that were for sin, and hear me carefully when I say this, because I'm not sure I can parse out the words carefully enough so you don't misunderstand. The sacrifices did not produce atonement. They were the sign that God's atonement was already in place. And therefore the sacrifices functioned much the same way in which confession functions. And in fact, if you read the whole of Psalm 51, the sacrifices and confession are paralleled all the way through the psalm, and there are some 20-some verses in that psalm. So when you sinned, and you were going to confess your sin, what did you do? You bring the sacrifice. By bringing the sacrifice, you reminded yourself and you acknowledged before God that God is the one who provides atonement, and in fact, instead of taking your life, he takes the life of the sacrifice in exchange for your life, as Patrice mentioned before. Did the people have atonement apart from the sacrifices? Yes and no. They were still in a relationship with God even if they hadn't offered the sacrifices. And ultimately, the reason they could have that relationship with God, as Hebrews argues, is because God had already pre-accepted, but remember, since he's not in time, he's outside of time, he had already accepted the death, resurrection, and ascension of Yeshua on our behalf to cover our sins. And he then, because even though that was to take place in the future in our chronology, it had already taken place as far as God was concerned. And so the atonement was based on that, and based on what? As Psalm 51 said, let me quote David exactly, unfailing love, great compassion. Didn't have enough words to fill it all in there. So that was the reality that they have, and in other words, the sacrifice did not bring a person into relationship with God. It kept a person's relationship with God current and up to date. All right, is that radical enough? I know that's not often the way it's taught. It's not usually the way it's taught, but I think if you begin to examine the text, and we'll talk more about this in the fall, that seems to be the direction of what's going on. Okay.
All right, so why does it always say unintentional sin when we know that intentional sin, because so many of these sins are intentional, and yet they're forgiven, as I gave the example of David. There's one class of intentional sin for whom there is no sacrifice. It's not every intentional sin, because then no one would be forgiven. But the one class is called, in the text, the sin of the high hand. The sin of the high hand is intentional, and it is not murder or adultery or stealing, or it's literally shaking your fist in the face of God and saying, you cannot boss me around anymore. I will not listen to you. There is no sacrifice for that kind of intentional sin. That's what the unintentional divide is speaking of, this drastic sin. And I'm not saying that if you said it because you were drunk, or because you were angry, or because you were, I don't know, not thinking correctly that day, that God immediately cuts you off. I'm not saying that at all. But there comes a point, if you repeatedly have this attitude toward God, I'm not going to listen to you, I'm not going to do what you say, you can't boss me around, you are not the boss of me, that God does take you seriously. And there is no way to get back from that. And I think that is something that we should all be aware of. Because people during the course of their lives say some of the silliest things, they say some of the stupidest things, they say some of the most hateful things, we say a lot of things. But this type of sin is a particularly bad and heinous type of sin, and it's not any intentional sin, obviously. What?
That's the description that you mentioned.
Yeah, you're shaking your fist in the face of God. That's the sin of the high hand, and it's very, very particular. Because God is not mocked, remember? God is not mocked. What you sow, you're going to reap. In other words, you can do all this stuff and just keep shaking your fist at God and telling him you don't want him, and you want to do your own thing, you're not listening to him, you're not following his instructions. And after a while, you're going to get what you want. You're going to get what you want. In the same way. Yes, remember, here's a very famous verse. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. And if you open the door, I will come in to you and fellowship with you. And it has to do with a very poetic way of seeing what your relationship with Yeshua is like. God can be knocking at someone's door, and they don't open up the door, and they don't open up the door, and God keeps knocking, and they don't open up the door, then God stops knocking. Because not to open the door after a certain period of time, you've said you don't want him coming in. It's the same type of understanding. God knows your heart, and he's not mocked. There is karma. People get offended when I say karma. Karma is Hindu. Karma is all throughout the Older Testament. What you sow, you're going to reap. That's karma. That's you are paid back with the same actions that you paid. Same thing that karma says. It's not coming from the same viewpoint as we would come from, but it's the same effect in people's lives. Is that clear enough?
Now, again, bring it into the dimension, we're back to dimensionality, of timeliness. This discussion is also very timely because we have the classic example of what the priest just described. His name is Pharaoh. What does the text say? Pharaoh hardened his heart. Pharaoh hardened his heart. Pharaoh hardened his heart. I think it happened 4 or 5 times in the text specifically. And then God said, okay,
It also says Pharaoh hardened, or God hardened Pharaoh.
That's what I was about to say.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
And then God says, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. In other words, what was God doing? He was simply saying, all right, I've been knocking on the door long enough. You've made your decision. Go with your decision and go with the consequences of your decision. Pharaoh's the classic case in point there. If you read the text carefully and don't have God hardening his heart before Pharaoh has already hardened it himself 4 or 5 times, he's just confirming or acknowledging Pharaoh's decision. Now, this discussion is not what is called by Yeshua the unforgivable sin. But that wasn't part of the question. So, perhaps the unforgivable sin another time, but not here, or not now.
Which is found in the Newer Testament, the
Yes.
unforgivable sin.
Now, or what's often called the blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. Now, this ran a little longer than I thought it would. I was hoping we've got a handful of questions, literally 5, appropriate number since we talked about the Torah, that came in later than these other questions that we'll deal with the next time we get together. But there was a very interesting line in one of those questions that I'll sort of toss out as a teaser. It's related to some of the concepts that are part of the Messianic movement, and somebody responded in the question, or raises this as part of this question. Those certain people who find it difficult to understand the Messianic movement, they make the accusation that nobody has taught this for over 1,000 years. If it were true, why would it be virtually unknown to the church? So we'll leave
Which
it.
I think is very presumptuous myself.
So we'll leave it at that. That will be the lead-off question the next time we get together.
It'd be more like 2,000 years besides.
Yeah. So, but we will interact with those. There's some very good questions in there, some very, very specific, and all very interesting. So, thank you for those questions. Feel free to send in more questions between now and then. And now I'm going to hunt up when the then is going to be.
I was going to say, and our next meeting is going to be, I will use my low-tech calendar.
Well, I want to check this because
Low-tech
it has
calendar.
ball games on it.
Mine has ball games.
Oh, okay. We will not be having a Stump the Stars next week because we had it this week. So I am now.
29th.
Well, technically, 29th is the 5th.
Oh.
It's usually our time off. But let me just quickly check to see what May looks like because we may have to claim it because.
Yeah, because we're doing the second 2 Fridays in May are taken up.
Really?
And plus, you're gone at the conference in Connecticut, starting on the 20th.
So what is this?
Milwaukee. we have tickets for 4 o'clock game against Milwaukee on May 20th.
Oh, on the 20th. I was thinking, what's this? Oh, on the 13th. No, I'm not.
There's nothing in the 13th.
No.
No, you leave for Connecticut on the 20th.
Right, but the 27th,
Is the Dodgers.
Okay, so we have May 13th.
And the 6th.
Well, May 13th would be the time we would normally do it.
Okay.
Do we want to do one, so then do we want to do one on the 29th?
It's up to you. Fine with me.
Yeah,
My mother's birthday.
Yeah, I'm thinking that we can go ahead and do one on the 29th, because we'll only be doing one in May. So our next ones are April 29 and May, what is it, 13th?
13th.
Okay. All right, those of you who are with us, are you going to be able to join us for those times? Yes. Okay. If it turns out that's not a good day, although we, as I recall, for the couple or 3 years we've been doing this, we've only had to cancel one for lack of people showing up, right? So, okay, good enough. Then let's pray, and for those who haven't already departed from us, we'll allow them to depart in peace. Thanks, Father, for this time together. Thank you for the involvement of those who are part of our time together on the Saturday night, but as well as for those who join us later by way of the recorded version. Thank you for the questions that we've been able to cover, for the interest that is there that goes beyond the questions, not only the parts of those who participate, but those who interact with those who participate. And we're grateful that you do encourage questions and you do provide answers. And enabling us to realize that you are the ultimate answer to all of our questions, even ones as difficult to answer as the ones we referred to last night, and the ones that we interact with come real mature. Why could these things have happened, or how could these things have happened? But we're grateful that you are the God who hears and who answers not only our prayers, but our questions as well. In Yeshua's name. Okay, thank you all, and
Thank you.
Shavua.